My name is Matthew Pearce. I'm the National Register Coordinator at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. We are a division within the Oklahoma Historical Society. Our office is located on the second floor of the Oklahoma History Center in Oklahoma City. If you're with an agency or a particular firm and you need a certificate, please provide your name and agency affiliation in the chat, and we'll send out those certificates at the end of the presentation. If at any time you have questions or comments, feel free to use the chat or Q&A function and indicate those questions there. I've set aside time at the end of the presentation to address those, any questions or comments that you might have. Today's presentation should run about 45 minutes or so. And so there should be some time at the end for questions. We should be in and out of here in about an hour. So kind of a crash course on how to do the National Register form in that amount of time, but hopefully this will get you started. The whole purpose of this presentation is if you're approaching a National Register nomination form for the first time, it's very daunting. It can seem really, really daunting to people. And so I kind of wanted to just break it down section by section, what we're looking for a National Register nomination. And my hope is that this presentation can serve as somewhat of a tutorial that you can come back to, or you can refer other folks to, as they're starting off on this process for the first time. So throughout today, I'm going to be referring to one particular property and one nomination in particular as an example. I tried to pick a fairly straightforward property. This is the McLean home in Oklahoma City in Oklahoma County. It was built in 1911. It's set on a roughly 2-acre property, and it was used as a family residence for almost 80 years. It was listed in the National Register in November of 2020 at the local level of significance under Criterion C. Full disclaimer, this is a nomination that I prepared in my previous life as a consultant before I joined the State Historic Preservation Office. And so when I was thinking about properties to use as an example, I thought this would be a good one to look at, because we're looking at basically one building here on a property. So a fairly good introduction to the whole process. So first things first, with anything that you do, whether you're interested in learning whether a property is eligible for the National Register, or you're starting out on this process of preparing a nomination, start with the SHPO, start with our office. The National Park Service, or NPS, revised the National Register form in 2012, and that form is available on our website at that link there. It's a Microsoft Word document. So right off the bat, one thing I'll let you know, this process is entirely digital at this point. So you do need access to some type of word processor, namely Microsoft Word, in order to complete the National Register form. But everything's in Microsoft Word, and it's an editable Word document. The major changes with the form pertain to Section 10 to allow for latitude, longitude coordinates in addition to, or rather than, UTMs. And also the property owner information was deleted. In earlier forms, if you looked at earlier nominations, you would see that there'd be a section that indicated who the property owner was. That information has since been removed from the most current form to protect personally identifiable information. So, all right. The other thing to think about is much of this presentation will be derived from or use this bulletin here as a reference. This is the National Register Bulletin 16A, how to complete the National Register registration form. In one sense, this is my Bible when it comes to completing National Register nomination forms, or when I have a question about how a form is being completed, what do I need to do, or what do I need to comment? This is the form that we use. Originally published in the late 1970s, it's been revised multiple times. You can see that it has not been revised since 1997. So it is an old document at this point, but there's still some very valuable information within the document. And then I also provided the link to the publications of the National Register of Historic Places page here. This webpage includes a wide range of best practices guidance and guidelines for evaluating and nominating specific resource types. So if you're interested in particular, say a cemetery, or you're evaluating a post-World War II suburban neighborhood, there's additional guidance that can help you evaluate and prepare nominations for those types of properties. So always kind of keep that, bookmark that page, and keep it in mind. So, all right. From there, we're going to dive right in and start with the National Register of Historic Places form. So this is going to be a blow-by-blow, section-by-section look at the nomination form itself. And essentially each slide that you'll see here coming up will have, on the left is a blank form, hasn't been completed, and on the right is a completed form. In this case, it's the nomination form for the McLean home, the photo that I showed earlier in the presentation. And I'll just kind of go through section by section what you'll need for to complete the nomination. Some of these sections are pretty straightforward. And I will say, if you're doing this process for like the very first time, oftentimes I can send you a copy of the nomination form with some of these blanks or checkboxes already filled out. But it's just something to think about if you're starting this for the first time. But we'll just get started here. So section 1, of course, we need to know the name of the property, and there's 3 blanks here that need to be addressed. First is the historic name, and so what does that mean? That is the name that best reflects the property's historic importance, or that was commonly used for the property during the period of significance. If it's the home, so like in my case, we had McLean family. I had McLean family residence as the home, as the name of the property. I believe when this nomination went to the National Park Service, I think they simplified that to just have it read McLean home. So pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Other names or site number, the section that the blank that's there below that, you can enter any other names by which the property has been commonly known. In the case of the nomination that I worked on, the property was originally associated with a homestead that was owned by the Barrows family, and so I indicated the other name being Barrows Homestead. But this could be the case of maybe the property was historically a school building and it's now a museum. You could enter in other names. You could mention the name of the current name of the museum, for instance. And the last one there, if the property is being listed under a related multiple property listing, enter the name of that listing there, or enter NA. Basically for that blank, contact our office. We do have certain multiple property listings under which we can list multiple properties that have a related history or of a similar type. For instance, we have a multiple property listing for Route 66. We have other ones like that. So if you think your property is associated with a multiple property listing, let us know and we can tell you what exactly you need to put there. For section 2, location, the first thing there, enter the street and number, city, town, state, and county that the property is located in. For the McLean home, that street and that location was 141 Northeast 26th Street in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma County, Oklahoma. If the property doesn't have a specific address, you can give the names of the nearest roads. For instance, you could say that the property is 1 mile west of the junction of State Highway 1 and Main Street, or something like that. If you're nominating a district, you can include just a rough description of the district boundaries, bounded by, First Street, West Street, Main Street, and East Street, or something like that. The box that says not for publication. Section 304 of the National Historic Preservation Act states that the Secretary of the Interior can withhold information about the character, location, or ownership of a property if disclosure may cause an invasion of privacy, risk harm to the resource, or impede the use of a traditional religious site by practitioners. So if you are nominating a site that in the very act of nominating the site or listing the site could cause one of those 3 things to happen. Let's say you're working on an archaeological site, for instance, and you don't want the location information to be publicly known. or if you're working on a culturally significant site and you don't want that the location information to be publicly known, check that box and we can withhold that information. Otherwise, leave it blank or enter NA. And then the box for vicinity, simply mark X in that box if the property is located outside the boundaries of a city or town. So if it's a barn that's located in, outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma, and it's outside the city limits, you could check X to indicate that it's in the vicinity of that town. Section 3, state federal agency certification. You leave that blank. That's my job to fill out. And that's also the job of our certifying officials to sign and fill out. So you would leave that section blank. That section gets filled out at the end of the process. Moving on, section 4, National Park Service certification. Again, you leave that blank. That is filled out, indicated by the National Park Service once they receive the nomination and they indicate that it's listed on the National Register or what have you, and then the signature of the keeper of the National Register is there and the date that the property is listed on the National Register. Moving on to section 5, classification. A few things, again, pretty straightforward so far here. So first of all, we need to indicate the ownership of the property. Is the property privately owned, locally owned, state owned, or federally owned? As it says there, check as many boxes as may apply. For the McLean home, the property is privately owned. And so I just had to check that box. If you're listing a county courthouse, maybe, public local would be the box to check. If it's a federal courthouse, that means it's U.S. government property. The box for public federal would be checked. So just indicate, with that box, what is the ownership status of the property? And that means the current ownership status, not what it was previously. For category of property, here you check only one box. So in this case, we need to know simply, are we dealing with a building that is something that was created principally to shelter human activity? Are we dealing with a concentration of buildings, sites, structures, or objects? That would be a district. Are we dealing with a site, or the location of a significant event, or a location that possesses significant historic, cultural, or archaeological value? Are you documenting a structure, something like a bridge or a grain elevator? Or last, are you not preparing a nomination for an object, something that is primarily artistic in nature, relatively small in scale? Most of our nominations a good number of our nominations pertain to buildings. You can see there the McLean home is a house, was a single family dwelling. So the box for building is checked. Moving on to the next page, number of resources within a property. So this is essentially how many resources are on the nominated property. And there's two categories to be aware of here. The first is a contributing resource. So contributing resources are those buildings, sites, structures, or objects that add to the property's historic significance. Whereas a non-contributing resource does not add to the property's significance. Maybe it wasn't present during the period of significance. Maybe it's no longer able to convey its significance due to alterations, or maybe it just doesn't independently meet the criteria necessary for National Register consideration. But basically, count the different buildings, structures, objects that might be on your property and figure out which contribute to the property's significance and which do not. And then the last thing there is indicate if any of those contributing resources have previously been listed in the National Register, you indicate that number there. So in the case of the McLean home, it was pretty straightforward. And for the most part, this is pretty straightforward. There was one building on the property. There were no outbuildings, nothing else, no sites, no objects. It was simply one building. So I entered 1 for one contributing building, entered zeros for everything else. So I know right off the, so as I'm reviewing this, I know right off the bat, okay, we're working with one building here. So that's one building that's being documented. Section 6 deals with determining the function or use of the nominated property. And we distinguish between historic functions and current functions. For both, simply select one or more categories that most accurately describe the property's principal functions. And I have the red text box here. You'll notice underneath each of those, underneath historic function and current function, it says enter categories from instructions. Those instructions are on the pages that I highlight in that text box. If you refer to pages 20 to 23 of that National Register Bulletin that I showed earlier in the presentation, that gives you a table of the different historic functions and current functions that you can choose from and enter into and enter on those lines there. So, for instance, if it's a house, as the McLean home was, the correct function is domestic single dwelling. If it's a religious building, the function is religion/religious facility. If it's a bank, the function would be commerce, and the subcategory would be financial. But the bulletin has a wide list of different functions. And then same thing for current functions. If the house was still operating as a house, as a single dwelling, I could have indicated that under current function. However, because the McLean home was vacant, not in use at the time of it being listed, the current function was indicated as such, that it was vacant and not in use. So the key thing to keep away from this is you enter the function for extant resources only. So, for instance, this was not the case for the McLean home, but let's say there was a barn that was on the property and was no longer extant by the time the nomination was prepared. I don't indicate the historic function of that barn in this section here because the barn's no longer there. So it's no longer doesn't need to be categorized here. And I will say, for those, for entering in those things, those functions, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I can figure out, exactly if you have a question about what specific function it is, I can help clarify that issue. Now we're into the kind of the heart of the nomination here. This is section 7. This is the description, and we're getting into the section where there's previous few sections are pretty straightforward. You're just checking a box here or there or indicating a basic function. Now we're kind of getting into the meat of the nomination and where many folks trip up or have a hard time moving forward. So this is mainly because we're dealing now with the physical characteristics of the property and how do we describe those physical characteristics. So the first thing that we look for is under section 7, we look at the architectural classification. So if it's a building, more often than not, it was designed in some type of an architectural style. And so again, I have there that the National Register Bulletin has a list, of different architectural classifications that you can select from. And again, you can also reach out to me. I have familiarity with the various architectural styles, and we can agree upon, or I can suggest what might be the best classification here. It's not a perfect science here. Style is in the eye of the beholder, but you can use that as a reference. But basically, select one or more category that describes the property's stylistic influences. So for the McLean home, the home was notable for its application of the Prairie School architectural style. And so under the under the instructions that I had in the National Register Manual, that's what I indicated in the architectural classification. Prairie School architecture is categorized under the broader umbrella of late 19th and early 20th century American movements. And so that's indicated as such. If you're dealing with a building that was built by the Works Progress Administration or the WPA, you could indicate the architectural classification as that. You can say other Works Progress Administration. Or if it's a specific type of structure like a truss bridge, you can indicate that in that section. If you're not dealing with a building or or a structure, you can indicate not applicable. So that's that. Under materials, simply indicate the principal exterior material. For the McLean home, it was brick. So it's pretty straightforward. If it's a stone building, indicate stone. If it's a log structure, you can indicate, wood. If it's a steel bridge, you can indicate steel. That's pretty straightforward. Just what is the principal exterior material for the nominated property. And then we get into the more written part of the nomination. So this is the summary paragraph, which I have there towards the bottom of the page to the right. Think of this as the property's press release. In a paragraph, describe the property's general characteristics, such as its location, property type or architectural style, setting, and significant features, and indicate whether the property has historic integrity. So in other words, this is the paragraph that summarizes the physical characteristics of the building. And I will say, like, this is the paragraph that I use when a property gets listed and I have to send out press releases. Most of my information for those press releases comes from this summary paragraph, because this is the one place where all of that information is provided. And so that's the summary paragraph. And then after that, we get into the actual narrative description. So this is the part of the nomination where you're talking about the physical characteristics of the property. And to be frank, the length of the narrative description really depends on the type of property that you're documenting. If it's a single building, it can be fairly straightforward. If you're dealing with a property that has multiple resources, the narrative description will be longer because you need to describe each of those resources. Regardless, so what I have here from the next couple of slides is just examples from the completed nomination that I did for the McLean home, and to the left is just some suggestions about what am I looking for when I'm reviewing a narrative description, and what is our review committee looking for, and ultimately what is the National Park Service looking for when they're reviewing these documents? How do we best describe the physical characteristics of a property? And what I recommend is you start by just describing the general site and setting. So for the McLean home, for instance, I indicated where it was located. How far was it set back from the curb? Where is it located in relation to major landmarks, whether it's highways? In this case, the state, it's near the state capitol building. Is it near any other properties that are listed on the National Register? Those types of things. Just give us an idea of the general site and setting. And then another thing you can do is provide a paragraph or so that just briefly describes the general characteristics of the property. In this case, this was a 2.5-story building. I indicate, it's a prairie school style dwelling. Note the principal construction materials. In this case, blonde brick exterior. It had, note the roof shape. In this case, the McLean home had a low-pitched hipped roof clad in composition shingles, wide boxed eaves, beadboard soffits, those types of things. Those just give us a general idea of how the building, what the building looks like. Just, as a, if we're just looking, stepping back and looking at it from a distance, what does it look like? What are the major features? Because when you provide that big picture, then you can describe the building in a logical sequence, so kind of start big, start with the giving us a general idea of the site and setting, the general, what the building typically looks like. And then from there, describe the building in a logical sequence. And I recognize here from the start, like, this presentation is biased towards nominating a building. If you're dealing with a structure or an object, if you're working with a cemetery, obviously the description is going to be different. But for this purposes, we're focusing on a building, and regardless of what your property type is, describe it in a logical way, in a way that makes sense. So for a building, that's looking at it by, from one elevation to the next, starting with the front of the building, starting with the facade. What does the main front elevation look like? And what does it look like, if I'm looking at it from the top down, or from the roof down, or from the ground up? What does it look like? And go, elevation by elevation. And, you move essentially from the exterior to the interior. So once you've described each side of the building, then you can also provide a discussion of the interior. And throughout, you're describing the specific features. In the case of the McLean home, one of the most important features that it had was, and is, a wraparound front porch. So made sure that that's described. It had an attic dormer. So describing that. Windows and doors are character defining features of a building. So, what's the window configuration? What does that look like? What are the windows made out of? Are these wood framed windows, aluminum windows? What do we have? Chimneys or any other decorative elements such as brackets or anything like that. Be sure to describe those. I mean, all of those will help convey the significance of the property and its integrity. So describe the property in a logical way and describe specific features that you think give it its historic character, that you think make it worthy of being listed on the National Register. One question that I get quite a bit, especially in terms of buildings, is, well, do we need a description of the interior? And the short answer to that is yes. How much you have to describe the interior kind of depends, though. If you, for instance, if you think the interior helps convey the significance of the building, then you may need a little more detailed discussion of the interior. If most of the character defining features are on the exterior, then maybe a more general interior description will do. In the case of the McLean home, the interior in part was what helped convey its significance as a prairie school style house. It retained most of its historic original features, and so that was worth describing in the nomination. So describing the spaces, what's the floor plan, what's the relationship between the various spaces, what happens when you step in the building, you move from the and you're in the foyer, is the logical way, do you then move into the kitchen or to a parlor or something like that? So describe those relationships. Any notable features such as fireplaces or built-ins, and also be aware of any historic finishes. What are the finishes of the ceilings, the walls, and the floors? So for instance, do the walls have a plaster finish, or is it drywall? What is it? Those types of things. And then the last thing that is needed for a narrative description is a discussion of the property's historic integrity. In part, note any significant changes to the property and the dates of those changes if known, and essentially summarize how the property retains integrity. So in the case of the McLean home, the building overall had retained a high degree of historic integrity. There were very few modifications or alterations. The only ones that I noted were, in some instances, there had been vinyl siding that had been installed over the eaves and soffits, and did not know what time that siding had been applied. So all I could say was that they had been applied at an unknown date. But then also made sure to note that the original historic materials were still present underneath that siding. So, and of course, the house is being rehabilitated. The goal will be to expose and repair that historic material. So that's the narrative description. That's kind of part one of the nomination, especially the big part of the nomination, describing the physical characteristics. What does the property look like now? How is it changed over time to a certain extent, but the main thing is, how does it look like now? How does it still convey its historic significance? So that's where the physical characteristics, knowing those physical characteristics and being able to describe them, that can be a difficult part of the process, but hopefully that gives you a sense of I guess how to approach it. And then of course, my job as reviewer, happy to help you flesh things out or help you identify certain things as you're going through this process when I'm reviewing the nomination. So we've described the physical characteristics. Now we're getting into, okay, well, why is this property significant? What's its history? What's its story? And so that moves us to section 8, which is the statement of significance. Got a little ahead of myself here in my slides. So the first thing we need to look at is what National Register criteria applies here. And we have other workshops that are available on our website and on our YouTube channel that provide a more detailed discussion of what each of these different criteria are and what they mean. So I'd encourage you to go look for those, when you have time to figure out which one you need. But this is the section where you indicate, okay, well, what is the property eligible under? Is it eligible for its association with a significant event, significant person, for its physical characteristics, or its ability to yield or potentially yield information? Check the box that applies. You can mark more than one box. And throughout that process, if you have any questions about, which criteria apply, that's where I can come in and help out. The other thing to mark on this page is any criteria considerations. So note, for instance, if the building is owned by a religious institution or was used for religious purposes. Note whether the property was a birthplace or a grave, whether it was a cemetery. Those criteria considerations are pretty straightforward. If you think it meets one of those criteria, indicate that box and provide some justification for that in the narrative section that follows. If none of those criteria considerations apply, leave those blank. So in the case of the McLean home, we made the case that the property was eligible under criterion C for its physical characteristics for its design and construction. So I only marked the box for criterion C, and then none of the criteria considerations applied, so left that blank. For this next page, for the areas of significance and the next thing that follows here, area of significance simply indicate the one or more areas of history for which the property qualifies for National Register listing. And again, I have in a red text box here the specific pages within the National Register Bulletin, as well as a revised guidance that was issued in May 2021. Long story short, the National Park Service has a wide range of categories under which a property can be eligible for. Commerce, education, architecture, transportation, the social history, the list goes on. And some of those categories even have certain subcategories. So refer to that guidance. And if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to me. If you've been going through this process, for instance, and you've already requested a preliminary opinion of the property's eligibility from our office before you even started the nomination form, oftentimes in our correspondence, we'll indicate which areas of significance we think the property is eligible under. And so that can give you that starting point, and you can simply enter those categories under those fields. Period of significance, simply enter the date for one or more periods of time when the property attains significance. This could be a single year, or it could be a span of time. Bear in mind, it doesn't necessarily need to be the duration of the time that the property remained in use. It simply begins at the time when significant activities or events occurred, and it ends when that significant event or activity ended. For the McLean home, we made the case that it was significant for architecture, and we limited the period of significance to 1911, which was the date of construction. And so that was the significant date. That was when it achieved its significance, was when it was built. Significant dates are those years for any events, associations, or what have you that qualify the property or that essentially add to the property's significance. So for instance, if you have a period of significance from 1920 to 1932, and 1925 was a significant year within that period because that was when the building, a significant addition was added to the building. You could indicate 1925 as a significant date because it occurs within that period of significance. Significant persons, as it says there, you complete that only if criterion B in the previous page is marked above. So in other words, if you're making the case that the property is significant for its association with a significant person, in this section here, you would indicate the name of that significant person. Cultural affiliation, you would complete this only if criterion D was checked. Essentially, you would indicate the name of the cultural group that was associated with that place, whether it's an indigenous culture or an ethnic group. But again, if you're working mainly with a building or a structure and you're making a case for criterion A or criterion C, you would leave that section blank. And then last, for architect or builder, enter the name of the persons or organization associated with the design or construction of the property, again, if applicable. You can certainly enter unknown if that information cannot be obtained. That's what I did in the case of the McLean home. If the property has no built resources, for instance, if you're nominating a site, you can enter NA, not applicable, or NA. Then we get into the other kind of heavily written part of the nomination form, and this is the statement of significance. This is in short, the historical narrative of why the property is significant. And similar to section 7, where you're describing the physical characteristics, section 8, it's broken down in a similar way, where it starts with a summary paragraph, the statement of significance summary paragraph. And again, think of this like the press release paragraph. This is where you can include everything that you think makes the property significant. And so I've highlighted in red for the McLean home nomination that section, which is the summary paragraph, and identify the specific associations or characteristics through which the property has achieved its significance. That could be events. In the case of the McLean home, it was its physical features and the architectural style. Indicate the specific criteria and associated areas of significance that the property is being listed. So, for instance, in the summary paragraph, I write that the McLean home is eligible for listing in the National Register under criterion C at the local level of significance for architecture. So right there indicates which criteria the property is being nominated under, which level of significance, and which areas of significance. And then throughout the rest of that paragraph, you can indicate any significant persons, cultural affiliations, significant events, associations, what have you. And so just that's that brief summary of the property. And then for the remainder of this section, think of this as if you're essentially telling the property story and why this property, why this place is significant. And there's not a required way, like there's not necessarily a required template for you to follow in terms of preparing a statement of significance. But what I've provided here are just some kind of helpful steps of nominations that I prepared in the past, some of the best nominations that I review, kind of how they're organized. And, because one thing to bear in mind throughout all this process is that while you may be familiar with the property's significance, while you know the properties or the place's significance, the challenge is you have to convey that information to individuals who may not have that familiarity, who may not have that same context. And so being able to convey that information in a clear and concise way is a challenge, I understand. And so, but these are hopefully some tips to help you. And one of the things that I find helpful is starting the statement of significance with a brief historic context. Briefly describing what the relationship is between the property and broader historic trends or themes, or briefly describing the history of the community where the place is located. For the McLean home, it was constructed on what was originally a homestead that was acquired during the land run in 1889. And so it may seem like a cliche for Oklahoma history, but for this historic context, I thought it suitable to start that context with a discussion of the land run and how John Barrows and his family came to acquire the homestead property. And so I provide some snippets here of how Barrows and his family arrived in Oklahoma City during the spring of 1889, how they ended up acquiring the homestead in 1891. Throughout this process, I'd come across an oral history, an interview from a descendant. And so, I was able to draw on that and provided some information on how, what life was like on that homestead originally, and then also indicated how that homestead got to be subdivided. And so I'm providing that information as well. So just providing that kind of brief historic context that, that gets us to, the property or the place that's being nominated. Also within the areas, the statement of significance, for each area of significance that you're making the case for, make that case in several supporting paragraphs. So it's not all that uncommon to see a nomination and you have maybe a subheading for historic context, maybe a paragraph or two. And then like what I have here is from an example from the McLean home. I then broke off, my statement or my argument for the property's architectural significance in, I put that under a separate heading. You can see that as architectural significance, and then went into and described that property's significance further. Talked about its, design and construction, and also, provided more detail on the property's association with the McLean family. You can, again, there's no set way to do this, but making sure it's very clear, which area of significance you're making the case for, and just making that clear for the reader. There's different strategies that you can go about that, but typically, using some headings or indicating, in boldface, okay, architectural significance, and having all that information under that heading, those are some ways to go about it. But basically, some things to keep in mind. You don't have to provide a detailed discussion of the property's entire history. Just focus on those events, activities, or characteristics that make the property significant. That's the key thing to keep in mind. So you're not necessarily having to provide a comprehensive history of the property. Focus only on those events, activities, or characteristics that make it significant. All right. So you've done all that work. You've done all the heavy lifting with the writing. The last few sections here are pretty straightforward. So once you've completed the statement of significance, you can think of that as like a history paper that you wrote in high school or you wrote in college. With every history paper, you had to have a bibliography. And so that's what section 9, the major bibliographical references, that's what that's asking for there. Cite the books, the articles, and other sources that you used to prepare the form. Have a little snippet from the McLean home nomination to indicate that. Typically, the reference style that we rely on is the Chicago style. You can think of that like if you've seen footnotes or endnotes, that's the style of citation that's associated with. Provided a link to their quick citation guide here towards the bottom of the page. And again, this is also, it's not all that uncommon for me, for my role as reviewer, to come in and help with citations, formatting, that type of stuff. I'm happy to help with that. The section below that, previous documentation on file, you can leave that blank. That's information for Park Service or for the State Historic Preservation Office to fill out. But again, if you have any questions about how to format your bibliography, I've seen it where you can just list all your sources in alphabetical order. If it's a more complex property with maybe a longer history and you rely on a variety of different types of sources, you can organize your bibliography in that way, where you can have a section for books, a section for newspapers, and so forth. However best you want to organize that is up to you. Then the last couple parts here, we have geographical data. So essentially, where is the property located? And there's a few key parts here. First, acreage of property. Simply enter the number of acres that comprise the property. For the McLean home, it was less than 1 acre. That was ultimately being nominated, so you can simply enter less than 1 acre. If the property is approximately 5 acres, indicate 5 acres, 10 acres, 25 acres, so forth. Basic number. What's the acreage of the property? And then where is it located? And so for here, you can use either the UTM system or latitude, longitude coordinates. In my experience, what I'm seeing more and more is the use of latitude, longitude coordinates, where the coordinates are entered up to 6 decimal places. If you're using any mapping software like Google Earth or Google Maps, that's typically the default way that coordinates are being relayed. And so it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to incorporate that into the form. One good rule of thumb to keep in mind is if the property is less than 10 acres, you are only expected to include a single latitude longitude point from the center of that property. For properties that are more than 10 acres, however, provide latitude longitude points at the corners of the polygon that represent the boundaries. And so if you have more than 10 acres, you're going to need to include more latitude longitude points that indicate the boundaries of that particular parcel. And then the verbal boundary description and the boundary justification. So the verbal boundary description simply describe the boundaries of the property. This can be pretty straightforward. It could be a legal parcel, for instance, like the northwest quarter of the southwest quarter of section 10, township 12 north, range 1 east of the Indian Meridian. It could be just that basic legal description. It could be a block and lot number. Lot 2 and block 4 of so-and-so's addition to Oklahoma City. Or you can give the dimensions of a parcel of land fixed upon a given point. And that was ultimately what we had to do for the McLean home here. In part, the property originally sat on 5 acres, if I remember correctly. And then through the years, it had been subdivided. And so, we essentially had to select a boundaries for the property that we felt best conveyed the historic integrity of the property. And so, you can see a more complex where, description where it's commencing from one corner, going east to this corner, and such back to the point of beginning. If you're having issues with trying to select a boundary, again, that's where I'm happy to come in and help out in terms of trying to figure that out. Because once you select a boundary, you have to justify, that boundary, explain why the boundaries were selected. And these reasons should be based on the property's historic significance and integrity. And the complexity and length of your justification depends on the nature of the property and the methods used in determining the boundaries. So for example, a city lot that has retained its original property lines, that can be justified in a quick sentence. These were the historic boundaries of this building because it has always been that way. That's pretty straightforward. The example for the McLean home, I had to provide a couple of sentences here where I just said the current boundary is the extent of the property historically associated with the existing building, and also noted that there were no other existing buildings, structures, or developed landscapes that were associated historically with the family elsewhere on that parcel. And then last, certainly not least, indicate who you are. The form prepared by section, indicate the name of the person or persons who prepared the form and their affiliation. I will say that we need this information because these are the individuals that are responsible for the information contained in the nomination form. So if our office has any questions about the nomination, about any information that's included in the nomination, this should include a contact information for who we need to get in touch with to address those comments. Or if down the line National Park Service has a question about the property, about something that's in the nomination form, we need that contact information so we know who to contact in order to get that issue clarified. So indicate your name, who you're with, email address, phone number, those types of things. That way we know how to get in touch with you. And then last but not least, in addition to what's provided in the written form, so basically you have a description of the physical characteristics and a discussion of the property's significance. The National Park Service and our office also require that maps and photographs accompany the nomination form. So we need a map to indicate where the property is located, and we need photographs that we can use as a reference to that way we have the visual evidence of what the physical characteristics of the property, what the property looks like. Our office accepts web-generated maps at the end of the nomination or on a separate Word document, and we request high-quality digital photographs. I'm not going to go into detail on those requirements here. Those requirements, they've been subjects of previous presentations, and I'm also going to be planning a presentation in the fall that deals more specifically with how to map, how to take good photographs, and also I think with that discussion also may include why, how, in terms of like selecting boundaries, like what boundaries should you select for a property and why. And so keep your eyes peeled for that presentation, later this year. In the meantime, if you have any questions about, mapping or photographs, if this is your first time doing a nomination, for instance, reach out to me and I'm happy to help in my capacity, because oftentimes our office, we can easily prepare the maps that are necessary, or if you need us to come out to take photographs, we can certainly do that as well. So keep that in mind. So with that, that's kind of a crash course for how to prepare, how to complete the nomination form in an hour, less than an hour, basically. But again, my goal is hopefully this can come back. You can come back to this at several points as you're preparing the form, and use it as a reference. So, but in the meantime, if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Feel free to post those in the chat or the Q&A. If there are no questions, one last thing that I want to alert you all to is our office is currently amid the process of updating our 10-year plan. And so we need you all's help to do this. And so coming in July 2023, we will be issuing a questionnaire that will be available to the public at that website below, okhistory.org/SHPO/state plan. And that questionnaire will have a variety of questions, asking about, what do you think our priorities should be in terms of a statewide preservation program for Oklahoma? What should we be looking for? What resources? What communities should we be focusing on? Those types of things. So be on the lookout for that. And I noticed in the polls, most of you who were attending, were either new to this topic or maybe a little bit familiar. And so again, I want to have my contact information here. Please don't hesitate to contact me at any time. My email is matthew.pearce@history.ok.gov. My phone number is 405-522-4479. As you're in the process of preparing the nomination form, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.